Welcome back at our next session. So I'm intrigued by the topics of our next session, which will dive into contemporary aspects of musical engagement. First, we will attend a round table concerning the variety of sources and objects collections have to deal with today. 4 case studies, so to say, will be presented by Hugh Le Caine on David Tudor's music, Luisa Santacesaria on Mario Bertoncini's work, Valentina Bertolani on experimental music, and Gayle Young, who we have heard on Wednesday already, will appear as a specialist with multiple perspectives to the field. Some of the speakers will attend remotely. There will be time for questions and discussions after the 4 contributions, and so I will give the floor to you.
Hi. I'm just going to start with saying a brief intro for the whole session before I get into my own presentation. We want to thank the organizers for inviting this panel here. So what we're going to talk about is about archives, especially in relation to experimental musical practices. And musicians engaged in experimental music practices often create various kinds of materials to explore new forms of sound and music. The hands-on knowledge required to handle and perform such non-standardized instruments tends to be passed on to others primarily through oral transmission, turning experimental musical practices into a folk art of sorts, where the living presence of the individual creator is often very important for preserving and understanding the material. However, we currently stand at a critical threshold of time where knowledge about all instruments developed by the pioneers of experimental music faces the danger of becoming lost. Many early practitioners started their careers in the 1950s, and if you're 30 years old in 1960, you would be turning 92 this year, which means that even those among them who are still with us will no longer soon. So this roundtable compares 4 case studies about the preservation of non-standardized instruments and documents related to such objects from the field of experimental musical practice. They each deal with a specific composer of instruments whose instruments are currently in various forms of archives. The similarities and differences between these studies might offer some thoughts for rethinking the musical archive. Since our time is limited, I would like to just go forward and start my presentation, which is called Archival Weatherings, the case of David Tudor. For some years now, I have been studying the music of the experimental musician David Tudor, especially focusing on his modular electronic instruments, many of which he composed himself. Last year, I put together my findings in a long book titled Reminded by the Instruments, David Tudor's Music, which was published by Oxford University Press. Today, I will present some afterthoughts of this research, especially in connection to the issue of archives. By the time I started my research, David Tudor had been dead for more than 10 years. The materials he left behind when he passed away in August 1996 was scattered in 3 types of archives. First, the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles, California, had purchased his materials and put together the David Tudor papers comprising of 177.5 linear feet of information inscribed on either paper or tape in one way or another. So this includes scores, notes, correspondences, schematics, diagrams, cutouts of popular electronic magazines, receipts, custom declaration forms, photographs, programs, sound recordings, and some videotapes. But the Getty didn't see much worth in the physical instruments that Tudor owned, a variety of 400 or so electronic and non-electronic sound-making and modifying objects composed either by him, an acquaintance, or some commercial company. So these instruments were separated from all the paper documents and sent instead to Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut, where they now form the David Tudor Instrument Collection, comprising of many boxes of modular electronics, commercial guitar pedals, materials to prepare and amplify the piano, as well as lots of plugs and cables. And aside from the papers at the Getty and these instruments at Wesleyan, memories and other relics are dispersed in the minds and homes of various people around the world who knew David Tudor in one way or another at different points of his life. The nature of these archives differs considerably. The Getty in Los Angeles on the West Coast is one of the richest art institutions in the world, so they are very well funded and very organized, requiring reservations to enter the special collections room and taking extreme care to protect their materials. Most paper documents must stay inside protective milers unless they have been photocopied in advance, like all the recordings which have been digitized. They are strict on time too, and you're requested to leave the special collections room at 5 p.m. because the archivists need to go home. Wesleyan University, on the other hand, despite being on the East Coast, is extremely relaxed about everything. A simple email would suffice to check if the room where the instruments are clustered in various cabinets and suitcases is not being used for a class on any given day and time. There are no curators, and hence there's no need to close the archive at any specific time. In fact, and quite incredibly, I was even allowed to stay a couple of nights in the room along with the instruments, not only touching them, but also powering them up, opening them to see their insides, and unscrewing the circuit board to learn how things are connected on the other side. This kind of access was obviously necessary in studying highly specific physical objects that cannot be cloned so easily, like information on paper or tape. As for individual collaborators who are dispersed in different parts of the world, there was always indeterminacy about how accessible someone is, although most people turn out to be very generous, how much they remember or think they remember, and their feelings about David Tudor, which tended to be quite complicated. My research consisted in making scholarly pilgrimages around these archives and connecting the different materials discovered in each place like puzzle pieces to examine a series of events in the past, what David Tudor did at a specific performance, why and how. And as I traveled, I began to realize something funny, which was that the contingent dispersal of materials across different types of archives with very different ways of preserving and remembering the past turned out to be a blessing for my project. It was because all the materials had gone to the Getty that I could find ancient receipts going back to the 1940s or scribbles on fragments of random paper. These were delicate and subtle things that would not have aged so well had they gone to Wesleyan. But it was because the physical instruments ended up at Wesleyan that I could open them up and even activate them freely. Which would have been impossible to do at the Getty. And it was because Tudor rarely made public the ideas behind his music that I had to visit his acquaintances and friends, which often resulted in me building personal friendships with them who usually had their own ideas about what to do with the past. Quite unexpectedly, therefore, this led to new collaborative performances, record releases, and more institutional efforts to recall Tudor and his music. For example, last year, there was a large retrospective at the Modern Art Museum in Salzburg. And next month, actually in 3 weeks, there will be a 10-day festival in Berlin, which will be from July 1st to 10th, if anybody is interested and nearby. Now, going around these archives, trying to coordinate the disparate materials took some time, but eventually it turned out to work surprisingly well. So much so that I developed a delusional hypothesis that David Tudor, who was an avid fan of puzzles, deliberately left behind materials as a giant puzzle for someone to solve. For instance, I found this custom-made instrument at Wesleyan whose functions were unknown. I opened it up and drew out its circuitry. And then, eventually, I found out that the name of the components in this circuit connect to words on a handwritten note that I found at the Getty. Which then connected to an article from a popular electronic magazine, also found at the Getty, that revealed its function. And you can see how the components are there all in the schematics. David Tudor had also redrawn this schematics from the article in his own hand. And so this instrument was revealed to be a 90 degrees phase shifter. Another schematic he had copied on the same paper connected to another instrument, a Wesleyan, which happened to have two independent circuits inside. And the schematics for the second circuit, which is a 180 degrees phase shifter, was then found redrawn on another paper at the Getty, which was further redrawn on yet another paper, this time with a hotel letterhead. Okay. And then this sheet with a hotel letterhead could then be matched with a receipt revealing the date and the location, which might then lead to a photograph where the instrument in question can be spotted, which could then map onto a diagram showing how things are connected, giving us some suggestion for how the music was performed and could even lead to plans for reenactment. In this way, and especially working with Michael Johnson, we were able to identify the function and the use of many extant instruments at Wesleyan, which has indeed triggered various projects to revive Tudor's music that was thought to have been lost for good since he passed away. But I also have to admit that there is a decent amount of indeterminacy involved in this endeavor. One of the problems is the weathering of materials over time. The Getty tries to beat this game with the protective milers and technological cloning, but many scribbles have become illegible due to the passing of time or the spilling of wine or other substances. Human memory is faulty and biased to begin with, which tends to get further distorted with the passing of time, making the act of retrieval and verification quite difficult. In comparison to paper or people, instruments made out of metal or plastic may appear to be more durable, but they're also constantly exposed to the process of weathering. Indeed, the policy of the Wesleyan archive allowing easy access to instruments has resulted in some of them getting damaged or broken or going missing over the years. This problem of weathering, however, undergoes an interesting twist in relation to David Tudor's music, 2 twists to be exact. The first is that such weathering of material was embraced as a method by Tudor himself, who deliberately used half-dead batteries or half-broken instruments for some particular effects they produced in the music. Tudor even created a piece called Weatherings in 1978, which staged the weathering process of sound materials through modulation and manipulation during the performance. But there is another twist, which is that David Tudor happened to consider himself as a musical instrument and offered himself as such to other composers who also regarded him in the same way. This is probably why he often extended the method of weathering to human faculties, like when he created as many recordings of the same sound source as was necessary to prevent himself from memorizing their identity so that he would always be a bit surprised by what comes out of the speakers. So the weathering of instruments also applies to Tudor as an instrument. After all, he was a mortal with a physical body and a finite lifetime. But in that case, perhaps we can say the same thing about all the instruments he made and used. If all instruments have a lifetime, it occurs to me that there are many potential biographies of other instruments nested within my research. That will tell a very different story because the focus on a specific instrument opens up other contexts outside my initial focus. For example, in the 1960s, it was customary for tutors to flip through hobby electronic magazines and books to find a circuit he liked. In the 1970s, he started collecting guitar effect pedals, which he submitted to peculiar uses. So tutors' electronic music connects to the world of hobby electronics on one hand, where the influence of inventors usually not associated with experimental music, like Rufus Turner, becomes significant. On the other hand, it connects through the guitar pedals to the world of commercial instruments, where the pedals Tudor used were also used by rock guitarists. So it would be interesting to track the trajectory of a specific instrument wherever it went, disregarding all genres and boundaries. Such an endeavor would obviously require financial and temporal resources, however. The more the better, ideally limitless. Yet in our actual lives, this is never the case. For one thing, we all grow old and wither and die someday. For another, I'm running out of time right now. Our resources are always limited, and I used to think that sort of limitation was a bad thing, but now I feel it's a way to let others take the stage. So I would like to stop on that note and pass the mic to Luisa. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. In my short presentation, I would like to link up with Hugh Le Caine's speech by talking about another case in which a composer's legacy is divided between two different archives, geographically and in terms of the nature of the materials preserved, namely the double archive of Mario Bertoncini. After the passing of Italian composer, pianist, and writer Mario Bertoncini, his legacy was divided between two different physical locations, the archives of the Accademia della Kunst in Berlin and the Fondazione Isabella Scelsi in Rome. What were the criteria for this division and what issues are emerging from this choice? To understand this, it is first necessary to highlight the nature of Mario Bertoncini's work. After graduating in piano and composition in the 1960s, Bertoncini began experimenting with alternative notations, instrument preparations, and extended instrumental techniques. One of the founders of the Gruppo di Improvvisazione Nuova Consonanza improvisation collective, of which he was a member from 1965 to 1972, Bertoncini went on to teach at the McGill University in Montreal, 1974-1976, and at the Universität der Künste in Berlin from 1977 to 1998. Since the 1970s, Bertoncini explored a new approach to composition. Besides composing sounds through traditional light-prepared instruments, he began devising new objects with their own sonic characteristics. He built aeolian harps and gongs of various dimensions, which is why he described himself as a composer-builder. Some examples of compositions using custom-built objects are Vele and Chanson pour instrument à vent, but Bertoncini built many more objects over time. For him, these objects could not be considered musical instruments. While instruments are adaptable and flexible and can play several different pieces of music, his objects would be usable to perform exclusively the composition they were devised for. According to Bertoncini, these objects embody the functions of both sound source and score, since in many cases he did not provide a written score. In fact, these objects can produce a pool of sounds, wide but still limited, that is defined during the process of construction of the object. For Bertoncini, composing means materially constructing the sound from the choice of materials to be used for the transformation of traditional instruments to the creation of sound objects of various shapes and size. Between 1998 and 1999, during his years in Berlin, Mario Bertoncini planned with the archives of the Accademia der Künste to donate part of the paper documentation of the works he had produced from the beginning of his career up to that time. And at the death of the composer in January 1999, 2019, after intensive examination and cataloging work by Valesca Bertoncini, Bertoncini's daughter and sole heir, as I anticipated at the beginning of 2020, the composer's legacy was divided between two different archives. The archives of the Akademie der Künste in Berlin took in the remaining paper documentation, thus completing its collection. The physical objects, so sound objects and instrument preparation kits, on the other hand, were handed over to the Fondazione Isabella Scelsi in Rome, which in 2022 started work on cataloging the materials. In the light of possible future performances of Mario Bertoncini's works, how can the two archives cooperate, and how can they serve musicians interested in performing these works? Since 2009, together with musicologist Valentina Bertolani, we have worked closely with Mario Bertoncini with the aim of giving positive ways of preserving, enhancing, and disseminating his work. The first step was to ask the composer to teach me to play one of his works for piano. And the work chosen by Bertoncini to begin this journey was Sweet Colori, a work from 1999 that includes 5 different preparations for piano and a mix of custom-made objects, store-bought objects, and medium-sized objects composed of several parts. From our first meeting, Bertoncini explained to me in detail the various preparations. So from the application on the instrument to how to play them, and he provided me with a kit to prepare my piano at home. And all our initial meetings, which I would call lessons on how to play a new instrument, were filmed and included in an extensive audiovisual documentation collected by Bertolani and myself over the years, about 10 years. From 2009 to 2018, in fact, Bertolani and I visited the composer at his home in Cetona several times a year, collecting testimonies from him through video interviews, audio recordings, and photos. We also followed the composer in almost all his concerts from 2009 to 2018, like in Basel, Cremona, L'Aquila, Montreal, Rome, Bologna, Naples, filming and recording the setup of the works and the preparation of the instruments. The performance of his pieces and the collection of the audiovisual documentation, in addition to the support given to Bertoncini in the various phases of the preparation of the more complex works, made us realize how much density of information is needed to reactivate the various works, and how limited and insufficient, although important, are the indications found in the paper documentation, like scores, sketches, preparatory materials relating to the various works, or the single physical objects. For instance, in view of the transfer of to the archive of the Fondazione Isabella Scelsi, the videos and the images of the work settings proved crucial in putting together the kits to play some of the pieces for which we have collected audiovisual documentation. But not only that, similarly to what Nakai did with Tudor, what is proving increasingly important is to connect the documents stored in Berlin and the objects stored in Rome also to the memory and the experience of the people who work with the composer on those particular works. In addition to the institutional archives, in fact, materials relating to Bertoncini's compositions have over the years become part of the private archives of musicians who have performed his works, as in my case, but not only. Here I see Francesco Dillon, for example, performing Elementi di Forma by Mario Bertoncini. For this reason, but above all, as historical memories and repositories of the performance practice of Bertoncini's works, the experience of the performers who worked in close contact with the composer and under his supervision on the performance of his works becomes increasingly necessary and urgent in order to bridge, clarify, and transmit to future performers and musicologists alike the connections between the physical and the paper documentation materials preserved in the archives. We as performance must collaborate with the archives and the scholars in order to identify the most effective strategies for the preservation and the transmission of the works. Composers, builders like Tudor, Bertoncini, and Gayle Young, in fact, are crucial case studies to identify new possibilities for archiving complex music legacies and start imagining archives not only as places almost exclusively for musicologists and sketch studies, but as repositories of musical experience in all its richness and diversity. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Valentina, and today I'm going to talk about Gayle Young. I believe Gayle Young does not need an introduction among this crowd. My co-panelist is an active Canadian composer who has been experimenting with a wide variety of sounds and ways of composing and musicking. She has created installations and site-specific works and performances, music for videos and films. She has built her own instruments. She has worked with electronic music as well as acoustic instruments. She is an improviser and performer. She has been the editor of Musicworks for a very long time. In short, she is an important actor within the Canadian and international music scene. Interestingly, Young has also been instrumental in the preservation of the work of Hugh Le Caine, the next topic in our panel. This experience made Young sharply aware of the difficulties of securing objects and custom-made instruments as heritage, but it also gave her the chance to explore many exciting developments in museum curatorial trends. Thus, collaborating with Young represents the perfect occasion to explore what kind of work a musicologist should produce to support her future preservation needs. The research and collaboration with Young at the moment is ongoing. So for this presentation, rather than delving deep into specific cases, I will give a very quick overview of different cases and scenarios that might arise and that are at the center of our conversations. Not all parts of archiving Young's work will be problematic. Her work will require archiving of traditional materials such as scores, sketches, audio recordings, photos, liner notes, etc. Young's archive will also require strategies to preserve her musical instruments. Even though it is not yet easy to find spaces to welcome them, and we know that is like a huge hurdle sometimes, it is hoped that nowadays the intrinsic value of custom-made instruments is becoming more and more widely recognized. Nevertheless, the conservation of custom-made instruments is not without interrogatives, and it is very helpful to dialogue with Young about her ideas on physical reproduction, digital reproduction. She also has experience in traveling with these objects, what it is required, and so forth. The material coming out of these conversations might be useful to inform future conservation decisions that at the moment are at the center of interesting debates. Differently from custom-made instruments, more ambiguity comes with the preservation of objects that are used in various ways during the compositional process and in performance. These objects are not musical instruments, but rather musical tools. These objects need to be understood on a case-by-case basis, both in their physical nature and in their function within the compositional process. Another difficulty associated with these types of materials is that there are fewer examples of conservation strategies compared to musical instruments. So the territory is a bit more uncharted. I will provide here 2 examples. The first one is about tuned resonators. Since the 1990s, Young has used resonators in installation and to record specific pitches in the environment and from the environment to be used in compositions. These resonators are tuned to enhance specific wavelengths. Usually, these resonators are tubes made of PVC, bought in hardware stores, lightweight to carry them around, and not meant to be durable. However, for the piece Tonally Inclined, created in 2019 at Carmore in New York, Young used custom-made resonators, as a company near where she lives makes exhaust systems in stainless exhaust systems for very large trucks, and they also have the tools to bend those tubes. She designed bended resonators in stainless steel so that, quote, people could listen up and they could also bend over and listen down to the same length, the same frequency, end quote. This quote comes from one of our conversations. At their core, both options are tuned resonators, but from a conservation perspective, the two options are very different. The steel tubes are custom made, and remaking them would be very costly and require a lot of labor. Their future preservation is worthwhile, and it actually saves embedded knowledge because of the design labor Gayle Young put in them. Instead, PVC tubes do not need to take up storage space in an hypothetical archive or museum. Nonetheless, it is of the utmost importance to preserve how Young applied her theoretical knowledge and practice to these tubes. Another example is about lithophones. Young also works with found objects such as stones and beaver sticks. With her lithophones, she explores the resonance of different stones through improvisation. This is another interesting case from an archival point of view. Indeed, while surely Young or any other future performer might keep their favorite found stones, each performer will have to collect and explore their own set of stones. This requires a very complex skill set. Thus, it is not a matter of oral history or preserving a specific object, but rather a form of knowledge-based documentation. The materials to be preserved must help us answer questions such as, how do you choose a stone? How do you engage with it from an acoustic perspective to find its resonance? How to best combine different shapes of stones? How to tie them together? Young and I discussed the possibility of organizing and recording workshops with interested practitioners to enable them to perform the lithophone as a conservation strategy. These are just some of the topics that came up in conversation, and many other cases could be brought to your attention, and with much more details than what I have done so far. However, I would like to close with a self-reflection on the role of musicologists and musicology in the process of conservation. While so many conservation endeavors are supported by the continuous and generous work of music scholars, this role that music scholars can play is definitely underplayed in the theoretical discourse. Indeed, comparing the work that Luisa and I have done on and with Mario Bertoncini with the work Gayle and I are carrying out, the major differences are that with Gayle, we're thinking about preservation together, collaboratively, and before any conservation is really needed. Sorry, there was a weird pop-up on my screen. So before any conservation is really needed. I can notice this is shifting the categories I use to describe materials from the ones normally used in musicology. Not only it incorporates analysis on a case-by-case basis for objects, but also for scores and performance practices, de facto articulating differently musical discourses. In this project, my aim is to explore what musicologists can do to help preserve objects and instruments now before they enter conservation institutions? What does a musicology that supports conservation in a preventive way look like? If you have questions, comments, or experiences, I would like to hear them. Please contact me. I'm so sad that I cannot be there with you and missing all the amazing papers and the super interesting chats. So please send me an email if you're interested in this project or if you want to share your experiences. I would just love to hear from you. Thank you very much and enjoy the conference.
Hello. Hugh Le Caine, born 1914, died in 1977 after a motorcycle accident. And at that time, composers, including me, talking in a reception after a concert, said, we don't know what he built. We don't know how many he built. We don't know where anything is. We don't know much about this person at all, except that everybody there knew something important. They knew one thing or two things or 10 things important. We didn't have an overview. So we decided right there at the reception to apply for funding to do an inventory. And the way things turned out, I did most of the inventory work. Over the next 5 years, I produced 10 newsletters that included photographs, explanations, how many of this, how many of that. And at the end of it, I realized there were a lot of stories. To give you one example, I was talking to one of the technical assistants that worked with Le Caine for many years. I found with all of the people he worked with, there was intense loyalty and intense affection, but yet outside the circle of people who knew him, we didn't know anything, as I've already said. So I asked this person a question about the policy. Why is National Research Council material so encased within a secret society? I didn't use that term. And one of the people said, if you want to know what really happened, turn off your tape recorder. And he started to tell me about policy issues that had changed. People who were in charge of the NRC who knew very little about what was being done there, making policy decisions, whereas in the previous 20 years there had been a very, in that person's opinion, very insightful and supportive management. I took that cue, and many others, to understand that the only way I was going to collect more of these stories was to do a lot more talking to people that knew Hugh Le Caine. That was the beginning of an extensive oral history, which you probably know by now, I didn't really set out to do, but the stories just kept emerging. It's like a tunnel going through different colors of light or something. And so in one of the interviews with Bob Aitken, who's a concert organizer, composer, and flutist, he said, and also he was one of the first students to work with Le Caine's instruments at the University of Toronto. He said his story should be written by a composer, and especially a composer who also builds instruments. And I said, but, I don't know how to write. And he said, oh, writing is no problem. You just have to choose who your favorite writer is. Like in my case, it's Charles Dickens, he says. So I read a page of Charles Dickens, and then everything I write comes out in Charles Dickens style, and everything's fine. So I started transcribing interviews. I applied for extended funding from the original archive inventory project to create a book about these stories that were emerging. And again, it was like a a giant tree. You ask one person to talk to you for 2 hours, and at the end of the talk they say, well, you should talk to this person and that person and this person. They all knew this and that and the other thing. So every time I interviewed someone, I had 3 or 4 more interviews, and it ballooned into quite a large oral history. Unfortunately, I didn't record them all. I thought I was making notes to write a book. I didn't know I was making an oral history of a period in musical time until later. So I have 2 stories about lost and found. I'll start with the found. Throughout all these oral history interviews, there were very few audio examples of anything that Le Caine had done. After I'd been researching for maybe 2 years, Hugh Le Caine's widow finally allowed me into the basement office that he had moved his things into, I should say some of his things into, when the National Research Council closed its music program in 1974. And on the floor of this office, which had not been entered for 3 or 4 years, on a concrete floor in a cardboard box about that big, were 25 or 30 reels of tape, the small kind, 6-inch reels. Some of them had leader all tangled up. Some of them had labels. Most of them, at least half of them, didn't have labels. This turns out to have been the recordings that we heard the other day. Also, the compositions that Le Caine created to demonstrate his instruments. It came very close to being lost. And so the next one is found and then lost. When the people at the National Research Council understood that I had been working at this project for quite a long time and I was fairly serious, they allowed me to read the entire correspondence archive from 1954 to 1974, which consisted of many boxes filled with very thin pieces of paper. Everything that Le Caine wrote was on a piece of tissue paper as a carbon copy, and everything that was sent to him was on real paper. I looked at the entire thing. It took weeks and weeks and weeks. They said, here's the photocopy machine. Photocopy anything you like. And again, I was too conservative, as I had been with the oral histories. Well, I'll just write a little note here. January 2, 1962, somebody writes to Hugh Le Caine and says this. I could have copied the whole letter. I didn't. I thought I could come back and copy it. Same thing with the photographs. I worked with the person who took the photographs, who worked at National Research Council as long as Le Caine did. He said, I'll give you anything you want. Tell me what you want. I'll give you everything. And again, well, I don't really need too many color images because here we are in 1982, reproducing color images is not that common. So, okay, I'll just take the black and white ones. And yeah, I'll take a few sides, but now I know where all the sides were and what the dates were. I can come back and get more. But unknown to the people that worked there and unknown to me, there was a plan in the administration to not use any more space in that building for archives. And it's called the Radio and Electrical Engineering Building, and it was 3 stories high and, very long, and had several decades of work from several different kinds of research in radio and electrical engineering. They put the whole thing in the back of several trucks and shipped it to an archive without a finding guide. So I have no way of finding the photographs or the correspondence archives. So that's the lost and found story. And I come back to the main thing that I value in the experience is the stories. That's what got me started, and that's what I have left at the end. Thanks.
So thank you very much to all of you. Are there any questions? We have plenty of time for questions. Yes, over there.
Thanks very much for that. So what do you propose to AMIS or to collectors or anyone interested in this subject, basically? What do you propose we do about the collection and distribution and organization of archives, et cetera? Like, we've been collecting oddities and the NMC, huge archives, EMU Systems, Bob Moog's, Don Buchla's entire archive, et cetera, et cetera. It's expensive to store. It's expensive to hire people to organize and to offer, photocopying, et cetera. Dissemination is a huge problem, very expensive problem. Do you have suggestions that are tenable?
Excuse me, the National Library, if I got this turned on. Yeah. Okay, good. The National Library asked me to organize Le Caine's papers, that is the things that were in his house, and things that other people gave me. And he had done a very good job of conserving all the articles he wrote, so they're all there. And it took a long time to organize it. The archivists who worked there gave me guidance on how to do a finding guide and all those things. It was expensive, as you say. It was expensive in both time and storage. That's why all this material that I mentioned is in some black box somewhere. It's the expense of storage, the expense of organizing. I can't really offer a solution. I hope you can.
I don't have a general answer to your question. I don't think there is a general answer. So in terms of like the specific case that I know, for example, the Wesleyan archive that I showed in my lecture, it was at that state when I came in, which was back 10 years ago. But as I went through my research, I went on identifying the boxes that were there and what they did. And so now we have a fairly good grasp of the entire corpus of instruments there. And so what happened was that throughout that process, we bought these, first of all, we bought cardboard boxes to put the instruments in. And they were stored there for several years in the same room, but in cardboard cases now. And I worked with my friend Michael Johnson to kind of, implement a chronological timeline to how things are, which instrument we put in what box. And then several years later, the university got some funding, and so now they have been moved to another room with, a lock and air conditioning. And because of that process, there's been several other composers and instrument builders who were around David Tudor who didn't know what to do with their instruments. And there's many people like that because I went on to interview these people for my Tudor project, and they would always tell me that with the paper materials, there's many institutions who would purchase them or receive them, but nobody knows what to do with these modular electronics. And these aren't even commercial products Mogo Buchla. And even people like Alvin Lucia, when I went to his house, he told me that there's many things in his basement and he doesn't know what to do. And so, by little, the collection at Wesleyan is growing, which might be it is a good thing, but also, like I said, the original state of what the archive was when I came in, I benefit from that. Yeah. So there's that too.
Well, I mean, the instruments are a thing. We spend so much time and money and various resources collecting and storing and displaying Tonto sitting here in all of its glory in front of us, but in some ways, the schematics that are responsible for this creation are actually more important. Because you're not going to be able to buy 10 microfarad capacitors for that thing in another 10 years, but you will have the schematic handy that future generations could actually build from with knowing what the intention of that component actually was. And you could actually sort of, approximate what the designer's intention was in the first place.
Well, yes and no. In the case of David Tudor, they might or might not be schematics, which might or might not have come from popular electronic magazines, like I showed you. But in many cases, there are differences between what's on the schematic and the actual instrument.
That's true.
And so it's, when whenever we embark on a project to revive a specific piece, we have to go back to the original instrument. That doesn't mean that we have to use that or that we can use that. Sometimes it requires cloning or even coming up with a a Maximus P patch, which would do more or less the same thing, but it's still, we need to see the actual instrument, and not just resort to schematics. And this is something that is very significant in Tudor's case. And of course, I can't generalize this.
But there are people like the MEMS organization that came to Wesleyan, to Mark Malkovich and Chip, can't remember his last name, to study the Tudor Buchla equipment and replicate it, which they've done. So now we have a working Tudor system, spatial system that we can study and reap the profits from, whatever. But anyway, thank you very much. It's just a problem. It's a thing that bothers me as an archivist and as a collector. And I know it's a big concern here. The National Music Center spends huge amounts of resource storing all the Mellotron tapes are here. It's that
Perhaps
kind of thing.
We could include.
I'm wondering if Valentina and
we could include Valentina and Luisa in answering these questions, because they also made their experiences. Can you hear us?
Yes, very clearly.
Yes. Hello, everybody.
Hello. So, Luisa, please, would you start to answer this question about how to deal with all this material?
So this is something that we are really discovering right now, because, as I said, all the fund made of sound objects went to Rome like 1 week before the lockdown. And so Valentina and I was not able to go there, so I actually have not been there since the objects are there, but Valentina did, so she actually has a direct experience about that. Anyway, it's really strange because I'm hearing my voice back, so okay, I'm trying to concentrate. My suggestion, in case of composers that build sound objects, is that maybe from an archival point of view, we should have an interdisciplinary approach. I mean, we have professions like restorers and people who work with contemporary art, so that the same problem is with artworks that are not basically paintings or sculptures made of very well-known materials, but we have the same problem of conservation, preservation in contemporary art. So I think that archives should preserve these sound objects in order to maintain their shape and their wellness, but they also should provide a way to replicate them in order to let performers play these works, for example. So I think that it's very important that the archive is not like the grave of the art, because these sound objects, there is an identity between these sound objects, so in the case of Bertoncini, and the work. So it's like, if I store one Aeolian harp by Mario Bertoncini, it's like I store a symphony by him, or a sonata by him. So me as archivist, so I should think, find new strategies about how to replicate these sound objects in order to let performers play again this piece. But it's a huge problem, so it's really, I don't know.
Yeah.
Not solved.
If I can say, Valentina. Yeah, if I can say, obviously, like you said, there's no, like, I cannot see a solution that fits all. It's like a case by case thing. But if I had to pick one thing that I would like to see different, is the more cooperation with the creator. like that cooperation at the moment, most of the times, obviously not all the times, but most of the times is lacking, because like preservation happens after the passing of the creators. So I would like to see what it looks like if these things are acquired in partnership and in cooperation between creators and museums or archives or whatever institution can store them, and like really work with the creators to understand the functions. Like the person that asked the question was talking about the intention, like reading into the intention. To me, that is very important. It's like reading into the function. The function is part of the ontology of a musical instrument. It's not like a musical instrument is not complete if it doesn't fulfill its own function. Otherwise, like a piano is just like a wooden box. So there is that. Obviously, we have to see how this cooperation happens, because, for example, I can bring the example of the Paul Sacker Stiftung in Switzerland. They acquire materials from living composers, but the way in which they acquire these materials, which I believe is very similar to how the Getty acquires them, is like through a contract in which basically the creator loses at the end of the year all the rights on the materials that they send over at the end of every year. So that is not cooperation. So I would be very interesting to see, like now we are in the process with the archivists at the Fondazione Chelsea to see what kind of entries we can do in the archives and how we can build the tree of the series and sub-series in Mario Bertoncini's archive. And I wonder if it wasn't me and Luisa and all the other practitioners, if this conversation was happening with Mario Bertoncini, how would it look like? How cool would that be? I think that would be really awesome.
Thank you. I spotted another question over there.
Yes, hi. I had a question also because I noticed that some of these archives are composers who are also builders, so it's two roles packed into one, but looking at the archive at UCSD specifically about the people involved with the San Francisco Tape Music Center, I noticed that some of these compositions relied on other technical roles that were not performed by people, like maybe, specifically I've talked to you about Carl Countryman and trying to look for archives for technical roles, and I feel like, well, maybe it's a question or a comment, but also how do we expand archives to include the reliance on people who are actually building more like equipment that helps pieces to become possible? Specifically in the 60s, I think that was a very central role. But does anybody have any maybe insight into maybe not archiving just builders and composers who are the same role, but maybe expanding archiving to the work and the spec sheets and the notes of people who are actually building, like either just mixers or computers in the case of Tony Martin or Jim. So maybe it's a comment more than a question, but just wanted to bring that.
Like I said, in the case of Tudor, the Getty has all the paper materials, and by paper materials, like that includes a lot of notes and sketches and schematics and manuals of the instruments that Tudor bought, like and the Countryman phaser as well. But the thing is that and I've talked with the curator of the Getty, but all that is connected to the physical instrument that, from what I heard, the Getty didn't want to start. But now, they know that you have to put these things together. But, Wesleyan is not going to let that go. So now, the Getty wants the instruments, but they stay in Connecticut. So there's that history of, specifically for Tudor, where his materials got dispersed in that way. and it's not as a simple solution would be to put them in one place, either virtually or physically. I myself, in retrospect, like I said, I value the pilgrimage that I had to go through because these things were like in different institutions. And the archive is very different. They have different policies of how to handle materials. And like I said, I benefited from that. But that's not saying, that one place is an ideal spot for something. And these also, they change. The Getty now wants the instrument, and Wesleyan now has a separate room for, these instruments, which were clustered when I came over there.
So yes, we have 50 seconds. So one just brief question over there. Sorry. And then take your questions into the break.
Thank you for a very fascinating panel session. So you each talked about the dispersal of materials, for example, instruments and documents, paper documents being in different locations and different archives. Would it be desirable to produce some kind of meta-finding aid, okay, that conjoins such collections, or would the assembling of such a finding aid itself be an interpretive act that could potentially end up hindering or distorting future research efforts?
I would go for the former. It actually develops rather naturally in the Le Caine situation, because after I did that inventory and sent out the newsletters to every music library I knew about and anybody who else was interested, every music studio that did electronic music that I knew about, the people at the university studios started to say, aha, what are we going to do with this? Which I don't think they had thought about previously. And it's not really a coincidence that they contacted the Museum of Science and Technology, as it was then called, because the Museum of Science already had the old Sackbut. Someone was donating the touch-sensitive organ soon after. And so along with the instruments and the boxes of miscellaneous parts, there were also operation manuals from different time periods. So the collection is not complete, but it is beginning to cohere, both here and in Ottawa.
Thank you very much. So we have another answer on this, yes?
Sorry, very, very quickly, and it answers both, actually. So in Italy, we have a centralized archival system. So when the Fondazione Chelsea creates like an entry subject for an object, what we did was to create an archival ontology for the work it relates to. So that means that, for example, if another archive in Italy has a paper document that is connected to that work, what they can potentially find is to link to the archival ontology in the national system. Now, since the other archive that holds the paper documents of Mario Bertoncini is in Germany, if in the future the European Union would like to expand the various centralized national archival system for finding and retrieval within the country to a European Union one, that would be a very nice thing. The thing that you can also link to, and this is the previous question, is you can link to specific name, especially for the object entry kind of form that you have to, that is usually used by scientific museums for technological pieces. It's not used so much in musical archiving, so it's a really new experience for the archivist to use that kind of form. You can also link the names of the actual builder, let's say steel workers or things like that, or even builders of clocks, because some parts of Mario Bertoncini work come from clocks. So ideally, if those objects end up somewhere else and they link to the national system, then there is this hyperlink between the different objects. And I think that that works very nicely. Obviously, it's an act of creation by the system, so it's not neutral. but I think it's very helpful.
Thank you very much. Thank you for these interesting perspectives on our topic. And yeah, feel free to discuss further on. Thank you.